Welcome back to another video. So yes, I've been gone for a few weeks, but I have been in the process of moving into a condo. So that has been more than sufficiently stressful, to say the least. And so I've been staying nice and busy with that, but I am officially moved in. And so I can now start getting back to recording some videos. And where did we leave off last time? Well, we were starting to get into the Pythonnet library. And so this was a new library where we were going to have the opportunity to work with a lot of Windows APIs that were primarily designed for the .NET framework. And we kind of realized that obviously there's a lot of libraries out there, and it's nice for me because it gives me a ton of content to write about. But I kind of just started picking and choosing, libraries that I thought were interesting, because I just kind of want to get us familiar with working with these libraries. Because, once you understand how to work with a library, I think honestly, it's really easy to start jumping over to other libraries, because now you understand like, oh, okay, so like this is how I select the object, or, oh, hey, this is how I make sure I'm passing through the right data types and things along that nature. So for me, I think just picking and choosing a couple of them, getting you comfortable with it, is more important than maybe going directly into the one that's going to be super apparent, because I kind of want to just, I would say, stretch our muscles a little bit, get us used to the idea of working with these libraries and then, using them. So the library that we're going to be working with first is called the System.Data library. And so this is actually, System.Data. And this library is basically supposed to represent the ADO.NET architecture. And so this is, again, data object. This is, if you've used the VBA reference library, it's basically talking about things like in-memory, cache, data tables, databases, things like that, being able to mash up different data sources, spread all over the place, and, use them in a very systematic fashion. Again, this is kind of a stretch, but I would almost call this the pandas of the .NET framework, because you're going to start seeing like, oh, there's a large similarity between the two. It's like, okay, we have these things called data tables, there's columns, there's rows, and all these different things. And you kind of go like, this kind of feels like pandas a little bit. I mean, it's not exact, but I think the overall structure behind it, and when you work with some of these objects, you kind of go like, oh, this is really familiar. Like this, I've kind of done this before. And so actually, this is one of the reasons I actually started with this library, is I think it's a nice bridge from pandas. So anyone who's used pandas, which is, if you've used Python, you probably use pandas at some point. So I think having that bridge is kind of nice, especially when you're going into something like a new environment like this. So with that being said, I'm going to be starting the code. I'm also going to put a link to the documentation as well, and let's start going through it. All right, so just like in any previous video, the first thing you do is you import the CLR. So this is importing Pythonnet. And we know that once we've imported the Pythonnet library, we can add references. These references are references to namespaces that contain all the types inside that particular namespace. So those are kind of like the objects in a sense. Now we're going to be using a couple different references. So we're going to be adding the reference to at least 3. The first one is going to be system. So this is going to be basically kind of just the default reference. This will be used for things like data types, things along that nature. The next one is going to be called the System.I_O input output. And this is actually kind of neat, because we're at the end of the video, we're going to be talking about how we can take all of our data and put it into an XML format. It's pretty cool. I didn't think you could actually do this, but when I was reading through the documentation, I was like, oh, you can. This is cool. And then the main one that we're going to be working with, obviously, is the System.Data reference. And so once you've done that, you can go from here and start utilizing those namespaces, because you've added a reference. So from here, it's pretty straightforward. You would just import those namespaces like you would for any other type of Python library. And don't worry if IntelliSense kind of freaks out and says like, hey, there's no library like that or anything. It will work. It's just IntelliSense, for whatever reason, isn't able to see it. And so it naturally kind of freaks out a little bit. Okay, so once we've done that, how do we kind of proceed working with this particular namespace? Well, you'll kind of find that a lot of these namespaces have a hierarchy behind it. And so again, anyone coming from that VBA background, you're going to kind of go, hey, this kind of looks familiar with VBA. It's like, okay, so you start at this level and then I can grab this component of that object. And so there's just kind of this natural hierarchy that exists a lot of the times with these namespaces. And so technically this isn't the highest level of the hierarchy, but I think it kind of is high enough to where we can kind of start exploring different things. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a data table object. And so this is basically a data table. It's like an in-memory data table. We can store our data table in a variable. So we'll just call it data table parent, and that will equal our System.Data. And then we're going to do a data table object. So we're going to create a data table object. So that data table object exists in the System.Data namespace. Now, again, part of it is being also able to read the documentation. So, okay, you've created this. How do I know what I can do with it? Well, the first thing you want to do is find the object that you're obviously working with. So in this case, I'm working with a data table. And Microsoft is pretty good about providing documentations for the different types of objects. Now, not every object's going to have nice detailed examples, but for the most part, once you see one, you kind of can infer the rest. But from here, it's a little bit hard because naturally you're jumping between Python and C#. So sometimes it's like, wait, why are they doing it like that? And I don't have to. So for us, if I want to create that object, I have to kind of, in a sense, initialize that new class object. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a new object. So that's kind of like this line where I'm creating a new object and it's going to be of the type System.Data.Data table. So C#, you've got to declare your data types and things along that nature. So what they're just saying is, hey, I'm going to create a new variable. It's going to be of the type System.Data.table. And what we're going to do is we're going to call it table, and it's going to equal a new table. Okay, and now once you've done that, again, each of these objects have methods and properties. And so, for example, some of the properties that we have about our data table is a name. We can have a table name. We can have a primary key. We can have things like minimum capacity, the namespace it belongs to. Some properties return collections, just like VBA. So, for example, columns returns the columns collection, so the data table columns objects. Other ones are rows, so we can have a rows collection. So certain properties will return collections, and then certain properties will return actual data types, things like strings and numbers. You then have your methods. Your methods, again, for the most part, are usually self-explanatory. So like new row, you can usually guess that's going to create a new row. Copy, I'm going to be copying my table. Certain ones are related to events, so you can actually define events with your object. So things like, hey, every time you add a new row, I want to do X, Y, Z. Some are a little bit more complicated just because maybe we've never really encountered anything like this in Python. So for example, we might be able to, write the contents of our data table to XML. So we're going to see how to do that in this video. But again, it's kind of just, I would say most of the time it's pretty intuitive, but there are going to be some moments where you just got to take a step back and say, well, what is this returning and what is this expecting? Because once you kind of identify those couple pieces, it's usually, you'll see that it's like, okay, now I know what to do after that. I can just do X and then I can do Y. So once you've created your data table object, let's give our table a name. So we're going to give the table a name, and we'll just, data table parent, and then we'll make sure to call the table name property, and we'll give it something like, I don't know, product table 1, right? So we'll just say, hey, this table is called product table 1. Now at this point we have a table object, but there's nothing really in it, right? So we want to put some stuff in it. Well, we know that tables are just a collection of columns, and those columns contain rows or fields, however you want to call it. I mean, I guess technically it's a collection of rows and fields, but regardless, at this point we have a table. There's really nothing in it. So now we're going to start going through and start defining the columns. So let's define some columns. So we'll define the product ID column, and we'll say with this one, we're going to create a new variable. We'll just call it column1, just keep it simple. This will be a system.data column object. So a data column object. So we now have a separate object. This is not part of our table. It's a column object. But what we're going to do is we're going to add this column object to our data table object. But before we do that, we do want to kind of modify our column. And so we want to make sure we give it a name. And so we'll go into the column name property and we'll say, hey, this column is going to be called product ID. Keep in mind, I'm not entirely sure, but it seems like if you don't give it a name, it just gives it a default name, something like column1, column2, column3. So nothing fancy. So it will assign a name. You don't have to assign a name, but keep in mind, you will then have to know that name as you're selecting columns. So it kind of does help when it comes to selection, at least when it comes to selecting using the key. I can also specify the data type that will be in my column. So I'll make sure to say, hey, the system.type, get type. And you know what? I want this column to have a string. So I only want strings in this column. All right, so I got define the name, define the data type. You know what? I also want this column to have unique value. So I'm going to make sure I set the unique property to true. And you might be going, Alex, how did you know that? How did you know it was going to be a Boolean? Well, let me show you once I find it. I read the documentation. So the first thing I did is I said, okay, well, there's a unique property, and I realized that this is a Boolean. I said, well, Python's got a Boolean. Why can't I just use the Python version of it? That's what I did, and there were no issues. So I was like, great, looks like it's fine then. So sometimes if the data type is, I would say, more general, something like a Boolean, Python has that. When you start getting very specific, like, oh, well, this column has to have the data type system.data.data column. Well, there's not really a Python alternative. So you have to use the system namespace to actually get that data type. Well, in that case, actually the system.data namespace. But again, the idea is hopefully catching on a little bit, but sometimes you can use the Python data type. Sometimes you're going to have to use the namespace data type. It really just depends. All right, so now that I've done that, I have one final thing that I want to make sure my column has, and that makes sure that I not want nulls. I don't want nulls in my product ID column. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to copy this a few times, and I'll say column 2, column 2, column 2, and column 2. So my second column is going to have product name that will also be a string. In this case, I don't care if it's not unique. You could have multiple same product names. And you know what? I'm okay with it having nulls too. Okay, so there's that. 3 and 3. And then finally, I want to have a product price column. But in this case, I don't want it to be a string. I want it to be a system.int32. And again, I want it to be false. And here, it's okay if there's null. So the system.data namespace is a very large namespace. There's lots we can do with it. Again, as time goes on, I'll probably add content for the different libraries. But again, just for getting us started, I think this is hopefully good enough. All right, so we've defined all these columns. Now what? What are we going to do with all these columns? Well, more than likely, I'm guessing you're going to want to add the columns to the table. Now, I kind of just did a little bit of exploring. So I was just like, I wonder if you could do this. I wonder if you could do that. And so I'm going to show you some different methods for adding. Some make more sense than other ones. And I think some just kind of I don't know. When I look at it, I'm kind of like, it just, to me, it makes sense. That's the only way I'll put it. So to add all these columns, the first method, so we'll just call this method 1. It's pretty straightforward. We just call the data table that we want to add the column to. We go into that table's columns collection, so data columns collection, and we call the add method. And then all we do is we pass through the column that we want to add to that collection. And in this case, you can kind of see like, okay, well, if I did that for column 1, I'm going to have to do it for column 2 and column 3 and so on, right? So here I've added 3 columns to my table. Now, how do I know that? Well, let's take a look. Let's make sure it's all working, right? Well, hopefully it works. So for example, maybe I just at this point want to do my data table name. I just want to see what the name is. I always get this mixed up. I'm used to saying name and now it's like, no, it's actually like table name. So I'll run this. Perfect. I made it a little bit bigger, but you can see I have that correct one. Okay, well, you know, I kind of did that. So I'm like, well, why don't I just do the columns one? And then, you know what, why don't I maybe just do the length? Maybe I could do that. I don't know if I can do that. I think, yeah. So this one, you've got to convert it to a list first. So I think you have to do a list because it's a collection, and then you do the length of that list. So here I now see that there's 3 columns to my table. So I could say for each column in my data table parent dot columns, what do I want to do with it? I want to print the column dot column name. So now I'm going to be looping through each of the columns. Okay. Hopefully at this point, no, nothing too crazy. At least that's the plan. So yeah, that's kind of the first part. Let me check the time really quick. We'll go a little bit longer. So to kind of show you method 2, what I'm going to be doing is I'm actually going to be recreating all the columns again, but I'm also going to show you some I encountered because I didn't realize this when I was doing it because I kept getting an error. And I'm like, why is it not working? Oh, it should always work. It never works. So if I was to run this right now, and if I was to re-add everything, right? So if I was just to say like, hey, I want to have another one or XYZ, even if I did a separate table, so even if I went up here and I said, hey, here's data table parent 2, it still wouldn't work. For whatever reason, you cannot have multiple columns that share the same name, even if they're going into separate tables. They have to be different names. Now, to be completely honest, I don't think that's completely true. I think there's something else I wasn't doing right, because to me, I would say that doesn't make sense because I can definitely load different data sources and there's no guarantee like it's going to be different column names. So I'm going to have to do a little bit more research as to why that is. Unfortunately, there's just really no Python content on this topic. So a lot of it is just I have to explore a little bit, but I personally don't believe this. I mean, maybe it is the case. Maybe you truly do have to have a different one each time, but I kind of find that hard to believe because what if I was to load from multiple data sources? Like there's no guarantee those column names are going to always be unique. So I don't know. When I find something, I'll put it in the documentation, but for right now, this is the workaround that I was doing. I'm sure one of you guys out there will do something and you're like, oh, well, this is how you do it. I'm like, oh, see, super simple. Okay, so once you've done that, what we can do is now add these columns, but we're going to add them to a second table. So we're going to add them to a second table. So we'll say data table parent, and then we'll give this one 2. I know, such a unique name. And we'll say the system.data table object. So we're going to create table 2. Create table 2. Okay, so we've created table 2. I mean, we should be nice to the table and give it a name. So give the table a name. So we'll say data table parent 2, table name equals, and guess what? It's going to be really simple. Product table 2. So now that we've done that, let's show you method 2. But method 2 can also be done multiple ways, because why else would you do it? So up here, you saw that I added each column individually, and you're kind of going like, well, that's great if you only have a couple columns, but Alex, what if you don't know how many columns you have? What if you don't know, all X, Y, Z? Isn't there an easier way to do this? There is. There always is, right? So the first thing that we can do is we can basically define an array of columns. And what we can do is we can use the add range method, which belongs to the columns collection, to add multiple columns at once. Now, there's multiple ways to define an array. And the add range method will actually take a Python list or a System.Array object. So the first one is I'm going to show you method 2. I'll just call this version 1. I don't know if that's the right way to do it, but we'll give it something like columns array. And from here, it's pretty, well, it's actually not straightforward, to be honest. We're going to do the system array. And the system array is saying, well, what is the data type that is going to live in this array? Well, it's a very particular data type. It's actually a data column type. So I'm expecting my array to have multiple data column types. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass through a tuple with each one, and then column 3. Okay, so that's method 2 version 1. And then what I would do is I would do data table parent 2. I would do add range, and then I would do my columns array. So let's see if this works. Hopefully there's no errors. And if there is, oh no, there's always something. Oh, I forgot my columns. I forgot my columns property. Okay, so there were no errors that time, so that's good. Again, if you don't believe me, you can say, well, prove it to me, Alex. I'll be like, perfect, I will. I will say data table parent 2, and then we'll do the column. So I should have 3. Oh my goodness, I have 3. Okay, so that's method 2 version 1. Method 2 version 2, kind of similar, but I think this one's actually a little bit easier. And if you can do it like this and you don't run into any problems, I suggest you just do it like this. You just make a Python list. Just make a Python list and store those values in a Python list. And guess what? It will work exactly the same. No errors. So multiple ways to do it. Personally, I think this one's easier, but if you need a little bit more control over the process, do realize you do have a tool in your arsenal to do that. But the other important thing is if you're going to add multiple columns at once, it's not the add method, it's the add range method. Add range method. Okay, so I've taken up enough of your time. It's already been 24 minutes, so long enough. So we'll wrap up this video in the second portion of it. But again, at this point, we wanted to get familiar with the System.Data namespace. So we saw how to make a table, we saw how to make columns and kind of set the properties of those columns, and then also add those columns to a data table object that we had previously created. So from here, what we're going to do is we're going to, I guess it's kind of unnecessary to be honest, but we're going to loop through and just show you how to print certain things, add values to it and stuff like that. And then we're going to talk about how to read data and also write data to XML. So that's what's going to come in video 2. Pretty cool stuff personally, I think, but I find everything interesting, so I'm not the person to ask. All right, everybody, we will see you in video number 2.